Okay, today's video is going to be about extending your standard AMMCO brake lathe's feed, how big of a rotor you can handle. So there's a bunch of issues, and I wanted to cover the parts involved in this. Okay, so let's start with a few basics. The first most important thing, let me see if I can get this camera to show it. Okay, there's only 4 inches of available feed screw. A little bit more than 4, it's like 4 1/4, but you can't use the first thread or 2 here. And the first thread or 2 here is usually trashed from people cross-threading it, and the first thread gets munched. So there's only 4 inches of travel total available out of that feed screw. There's no magical solution for that problem other than lengthening the threads on the feed screw, which that's a whole other story. I do that on my hybrid upgrade. For most everybody, 4 inches should cover what you need. There's not really a lot of rotors with 4 inches of brake pad area. You know, that's only when you get into really big stuff like RVs and stuff like that. Your regular cutter head can't even handle 4 inches. This cutter head here can handle nearly 5. But you also have the problem with you still have to put silencer bands on it, which the silencer springs take up another 3/4 of an inch of the space on the cutter head here. So if you want to cut big stuff, there's a couple of factors. When you change and put an extended feed nut on there, what you've done is you've moved the maximum distance that you can travel. You still only got 4 inches, you just moved it out there 1.5 inches, right? So you should be aware that what you're getting there, some of that is going to come off of how far in it can go on some machines. I've had people complain that, yeah, I actually had a customer complain that while it did have the travel out that he needed, he lost some on the inside. I don't see where that would be a problem, seeing how you can pivot the cutter head on its access point. Like if you move it over to here and rotate the cutter head, you can get an extra inch of rotor diameter out of the machine, because it doesn't really matter what angle the rotor goes into the cutter head as long as it clears. So you can simply adjust your blades so that they come off the rotor at approximately the same time, and you're golden. That'll handle most stuff. If your machine is old-fashioned and has this short little guide bar, that's the bar that goes right down there on the machine, right? This one only has about 3 inches of travel possible on it. This is one of the reasons why I prefer to replace that with a longer guide bar. And if you have the double D shaft, just machine off the first inch, 1.5 inches off of each side, and clean out your machine and make the guide bar slide through the machine with some grease on it, put a boot on the inside and everything. Which brings me to the other point. The thing I like about replacing the guide bar, when we attach the guide bar onto the cross-feed carriage, we increase the stability of the cutter head. If we're going to talk about cutting bigger rotors, we need to look at that aspect of it. So keep in mind, the further you go out, the more stability matters. So getting rid of the guide bar is a must if you're going to extend it. This gearbox here has a standard feed nut on it that I just turned around backwards. And if you look, that gets me, this is the end of the travel for the trap shaft. That's as far as it'll go, right there. Right? Okay. We can't make this crossfeed go any further out than the limit of the trap shaft's travel, right? So there's the meat in the gearbox. The trap shaft is way back here when this is fully extended. That's as far as it's going to go. You're not going to get any more feed out of that gearbox than you will by reversing the stock feed nut rather than buying the super expensive extended feed nut. The super extended feed nut has the same total length. It's going to end up in that same spot. They already figured this out. Now if you have a short guide bar like this one, you can only extend it with a 1/2 inch extension, which gives you, because of its lathe dimensions, a 1/2 inch further out in this direction is actually 1 inch of rotor diameter. So if you could do a 11-inch rotor before, an extra 1/2 inch of travel would get you to a 12-inch rotor. You'd get 1 extra inch out of it. Now, there's another issue. When you go to swap out the feed nut that you see in this gearbox, this is a later gearbox. The earlier gearboxes, you pull them off and you find you don't have a replaceable nut. You have this cast in part of the cast iron, and this gets stripped out. If you want to replace and make this into a feed nut, you're going to have to machine this flat and centered all the way down big enough to put a regular feed nut in there. That's pretty far recessed. So then you're going to need to extend it way the hell out there. To about the 2-inch mark. Actually, I would say just short of 2 inches. 1 3/4 inches. And that's going to be the limit of how far out you can go. But keep in mind, since we only have 4 inches here, that's your limitation. That's the most travel we're going to get out of that feed screw. That gearbox was designed to work with that feed screw. All you're doing when you extend the feed is you're extending the position where it'll travel from the end, from all the way in to going all the way out. Not all machines have a problem on the way in. Most people don't care that it doesn't go in as much as it used to, but that can be why you have problems with certain oddball rotors. So on the feed nut thing, if you have a later machine, you can just spin that nut around and put it right back on there, and you don't have to buy the $85 extended feed nut. So to briefly sum up, the limitations are the feed screw. You're only going to get 4 inches of travel out of there. Your guide bar really should be attached. If you want to run way the hell out there, you're going to need more stability. The best place to get that is with a new guide bar solidly attached and traveling with the crossfeed carriage. If you have this style of guide bar and a cast steel housing, you probably should forget about extending that on the cheap. You're not going to be too happy with the end results, because your gearbox is going to be a pain in the butt. If it's a cast steel gearbox and you have to replace the nut, that's another big fiasco. For what you're going to have to go through by replacing or modifying the gearbox and the guide bar and everything, you'd be better off buying my kit with the power feed upgrade that takes care of all that stuff. My kit still uses the factory screw, so it's only going to give you 4 inches, but I could put that way the hell out there, and 14-inch rotors aren't really an issue with the power feed upgrade. And by the time you get out there, you need the extra stability, you need a smoother operating gearbox, and other features make it well worth your time and trouble. One of the ways that my power feed upgrade rocks is it does the larger stuff way better. When we're heading for 14-inch rotors, we're kind of at the limit of what the stock configuration of this machine was ready to handle. Anyway, I hope that covers all the stuff. There's also one thing I should mention. Whoop. When you put the extended feed nut, there's a spring on the trap shaft back here that's captured by the screw that keeps it from being pulled out. You should ditch that. If you're going to put the extended feed nut on there, you got to take that spring out and get rid of it, because the spring will bind before you get to the end of the extension, and that'll break your shear gear the second that happens every time. So don't forget to take out that spring, or make sure that it's not there. If it has the spring in the back of that gearbox, you got to remove that or cut it down to almost nothing to work in there. I prefer to ditch it. It just don't screw around. Why chew up a pair of wire cutters when you could just ditch the spring? It doesn't really help with anything. Anyway, hope this helps everybody with their issues. Thanks. Bye.